My own children robbed me blind. My hands trembled. My heart pounded. I couldn't catch my breath. But they had no idea what was coming next. I was sitting at my kitchen table in February 2020, staring at credit card statements and loan papers with my forged signature, realizing that my son Rick and daughter Linda had been systematically stealing my identity while I grieved their father's death. The children I'd sacrificed everything for had turned their grieving mother into a victim of financial fraud. I'm Carol Richardson, and I'm 74 years old. I'm here in my beautiful conservatory in my Victorian home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, surrounded by 28 women over 50 who call me Mama Carol. Women who found family when their own relatives abandoned them. Tell me in the comments what you're doing right now while you listen to my story. Are you having your morning coffee, maybe thinking about your own children, or just taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button because each like is so important to help my voice reach other mothers who might be drowning in guilt disguised as love. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because no woman should have to learn the devastating difference between helping and enabling alone. You see, I'm sitting here now surrounded by women who chose to love me rather than use me. But 5 years ago, I was facing bankruptcy and homelessness, believing that being a good mother meant saying yes to every crisis, every sob story, every desperate phone call from children who had learned that my love came with an open checkbook. What Rick and Linda didn't know when they were forging my signature on loan applications was that their father had planted a seed 25 years earlier that was about to bloom into $38 million. I thought sacrifice meant giving until it hurt. I was about to learn that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is finally learning to say no. I was born Carol Jean Mitchell in 1951 in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where my mother taught me that a woman's worth was measured by how much she could endure for her family. I married my high school sweetheart, Jim Richardson, in 1970, and we built what looked like the perfect American life in our small Iowa town. Jim worked as an electrical engineer for John Deere, and I taught second grade at Lincoln Elementary until Rick was born in 1973, followed by Linda in 1975. Those early years were pure happiness. Sunday dinners at my mother's house, summer evenings on our front porch swing, Christmas mornings filled with children's laughter and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking. Cedar Falls in the 1980s was Norman Rockwell come to life. We knew our neighbors, our children played safely in yards without fences, and the biggest excitement was the annual Sturgis Falls celebration each June. Jim and I saved for family vacations to Wisconsin Dells, splurged on a pool in our backyard, and planned for our children's college educations. But even in those innocent years, I could see troubling patterns forming. Rick had a temper that exploded when he didn't get his way, and Linda learned early that tears could manipulate adults into giving her whatever she wanted. When Rick was caught stealing candy from Hy-Vee at age 8, I made excuses about him being confused rather than addressing the dishonesty. When Linda threw screaming fits until we bought her expensive toys, I told myself I was showing love by giving in to her demands. Jim worried about my tendency to rescue our children from natural consequences. "Carol, you can't solve every problem for them," he'd say, after I'd driven to the high school to deliver forgotten homework for the 3rd time that month. "They need to learn responsibility." But I couldn't bear to see my children suffer, even the minor discomfort of a poor grade or a teacher's disapproval. The real problem started when the kids reached their 20s. Rick discovered gambling during his senior year at the University of Northern Iowa, and what started as poker games with friends escalated into casino trips and online betting. Linda developed a shopping addiction that left her drowning in credit card debt by age 23, buying designer clothes and expensive makeup to fill some emptiness I couldn't understand. By 1998, I was regularly loaning Rick money to cover gambling losses, while Jim urged me to let our son face the consequences of his choices. "He's 25 years old, Carol. If he can't manage money, maybe he needs to learn the hard way," Jim would say. But Rick's desperate phone calls always convinced me that this time was different, that he'd learned his lesson, that he just needed one more chance. Linda's crisis calls were equally effective. "Mom, They're going to shut off my electricity, she'd sob. I have the kids to think about. You wouldn't want your grandchildren sitting in the dark, would you? So I'd write another check, telling myself I was protecting innocent children rather than enabling their irresponsible mother. Jim tried to set boundaries, but I undermined him every time. When he refused to give Rick money for a business opportunity, I'd secretly write a check from our savings. When he suggested Linda needed financial counseling, I'd slip her cash just for groceries that inevitably went toward unnecessary purchases. The pattern continued for over 20 years, with increasing amounts and decreasing intervals between crises. Rick's gambling addiction escalated to the point where he was borrowing from dangerous people, while Linda's spending created a mountain of debt that bankruptcy couldn't even eliminate. What I didn't know was that in 1999, Jim had made a quiet decision that would change everything. He'd invested $5,000 of his bonus in a tiny startup called Data Sync Solutions, a company developing software for medical records. It was money I'd completely forgotten about, buried in paperwork I never examined. Jim passed away suddenly of a heart attack in 2017, and his last words to me were, "Carol, you have to stop saving them from themselves. They'll destroy you if you let them." I promised him I'd set boundaries, but within a week of his funeral, both children were at my door with financial emergencies that seemed more urgent than ever. But that forgotten investment was about to reveal the difference between love and manipulation, between family and parasites, between the children who drain you and the women who would become my real daughters. After Jim's funeral, the financial emergencies from my children didn't just continue. They escalated to a level that should have terrified me. It was as if they sensed that the voice of reason in our family was gone, and now there was no one to protect me from their increasingly desperate demands. Rick, now 44 years old, had never successfully held a job for more than 18 months. His gambling had evolved from weekend casino trips to round-the-clock online poker and sports betting that he convinced himself was investing. By 2018, he was calling me almost daily with increasingly frantic stories about bookies, loan sharks, and business opportunities that required immediate cash injections. "Mom, you don't understand," he'd say, his voice shaking with what I thought was fear, but now recognized as withdrawal from gambling addiction. "These people don't fool around. If I don't have their money by Friday, something bad is going to happen to my family." The threats always involved his wife, Sarah, and their twin daughters, my precious 8-year-old granddaughters, Emma and Ella, who became unwitting weapons in Rick's manipulation arsenal. I'd depleted most of our savings during Jim's final illness, but I still had our retirement accounts, the house, and a modest life insurance payout. Each crisis seemed more urgent than the last, and Rick had learned exactly which buttons to push to open my checkbook. "Do you want Emma and Ella to grow up without a father?" he'd ask when I hesitated. "Because that's what's going to happen if you don't help me." Linda, now 42, had developed an even more sophisticated approach to financial manipulation. Her shopping addiction had evolved into what she called business ventures, multi-level marketing schemes that required substantial upfront investments. She'd arrive at my house with glossy presentations about makeup companies, nutrition supplements, and jewelry businesses that would finally make her financially independent. "Mom, this is my chance to build something real," she'd say, spreading brochures across my kitchen table while her own children, 10-year-old Michael and 8-year-old Sophie, played in my backyard. "I just need $6,000 to get started, and I'll pay you back with interest within 6 months." Linda's schemes always failed within weeks, but somehow each failure only convinced her that the next opportunity would be different. The warning signs were everywhere, but grief had clouded my judgment. Sarah, Rick's wife, stopped making eye contact during family gatherings, and the twins seemed anxious whenever money was discussed. Linda's husband, Paul, had moved out after discovering another secret credit card, leaving her as a single mother with even more financial pressure and manipulation tactics. My neighbors at Faith Lutheran began asking gentle questions about my children's frequent visits, always accompanied by intense conversations and my obvious distress afterward. "Carol, honey, you look exhausted," my friend Martha would say after Rick's latest crisis call interrupted our Bible study. Is everything all right at home? But I was too embarrassed to admit that my successful, educated children were slowly bleeding me dry. Rick had a college degree in business and years of work experience, but somehow never managed to keep employment when gambling opportunities called. Linda was intelligent and capable, but her get-rich-quick schemes always took priority over steady work. The breaking point began in early 2019 when I realized I couldn't make my property tax payment without borrowing against the house. I'd already emptied my retirement accounts, spent Jim's life insurance money, and sold most of my jewelry to fund my children's emergencies. The house that had been paid off for 12 years was now mortgaged to cover gambling debts and failed business ventures. That's when Rick suggested I should simplify my finances by giving him power of attorney to help manage my bills. "Mom, you're 68 years old and dealing with a lot of stress," he said with convincing concern. "Let me handle the financial stuff so you can focus on your health." Linda supported the idea enthusiastically, offering to help with banking and organizing my important documents. My gut instinct screamed warnings, but my maternal guilt was stronger. These were my children, the babies I'd nursed and nurtured, the young people I'd sacrificed everything to educate and support. How could I doubt their motives when they were offering to help their grieving mother manage complicated finances? What I didn't realize was that my power of attorney was about to become their hunting license. Within months, they were using my personal information to open credit cards, apply for loans, and access accounts I didn't even know existed. They'd learned that a desperate mother with good credit was more valuable than any casino jackpot or shopping spree. The phone calls became more frequent, and the amounts larger. Rick needed $12,000 for a sure-thing sports betting system. Linda required $8,000 to save her house from foreclosure. Each emergency was more urgent than the last, each story more heartbreaking, each promise of repayment more convincing. By fall 2019, I was surviving on Social Security and food from the church pantry while my children lived in comfortable homes and drove newer cars than I'd ever owned. I was too ashamed to tell anyone the truth about my financial situation, too guilty to admit that unlimited love had created unlimited exploitation. But the universe was about to deliver justice in a way none of us could have anticipated. That forgotten investment from 1999 was quietly growing in value, and DataSync Solutions was about to be acquired by IBM in a deal that would transform my $5,000 investment into $38 million. My children thought they were draining a dry well. They had no idea they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives about the difference between unconditional love and unlimited enabling. The moment that changed everything came on a bitter February morning in 2020, when I opened my credit report and discovered that my financial death was even worse than I'd imagined. But it wasn't the $26,000 in unauthorized debt that shattered my world. It was the evidence of betrayal that I'd been too trusting to see coming. Sitting at my kitchen table with papers spread everywhere, I found credit cards in my name that I'd never applied for, loans with my signature that I'd never signed, and bank accounts that had been opened and drained without my knowledge. My children hadn't just asked for help. They'd been systematically stealing my identity for over 18 months. The Citibank statement showed a credit card with a $15,000 limit that had been maxed out at the Riverside Casino in Iowa City. The signature looked like mine, but I'd never been to that casino, never applied for that card, never authorized those charges. My hands shook as I found another statement from Quick Cash Loans, showing multiple payday advances in my name with interest rates that made my stomach turn. Rick had forged my signature on loan applications, using my Social Security number and banking information to create a network of debt that was legally my responsibility. Linda had been more sophisticated, using my identity to open online shopping accounts and taking out personal loans that she'd immediately spent on luxury items for herself and her children. 25 years of financial sacrifice, and this was my reward. My own children had turned me into a victim of identity theft. The mother who had given them everything had become nothing more than a credit score to be exploited and a signature to be forged. I called Rick first, my voice barely steady enough to speak. Rick, I need you to explain these credit cards and loans that appear to be in my name. The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had the practiced tone of someone who'd prepared for this conversation. Mom, you gave me permission to handle those things for you. Remember? You said you were overwhelmed with Dad's bills and wanted help managing everything. Permission? As if agreeing to let him help with my electric bill was authorization to forge my signature on gambling loans. Rick, I never agreed to $15,000 in casino debt. I never signed papers for payday loans. You stole my identity. The words felt foreign in my mouth because I'd never imagined I'd have to accuse my own son of theft. Mom, you're confused. Grief can affect memory, and you've been under a lot of stress. We talked about all these financial arrangements. He was gaslighting me, trying to convince me that my own memory was unreliable, that agreeing to help with one bill meant consenting to financial fraud. Linda's response was even more calculated. Mom, I'm really concerned about your mental state. These accusations don't make sense, and I think you might need to see a doctor about memory issues. She was using her psychology degree to suggest I was mentally incompetent, that the evidence of their theft was actually evidence of my cognitive decline. Both of my children had prepared for this confrontation, and their strategy was to paint their crime as my confusion. They'd stolen my identity, destroyed my credit, and bankrupted my future, and now they were trying to convince me that I was too old and grief-stricken to understand my own financial records. If you're feeling the betrayal and shock of this moment with me, show your support. Hit that like button, comment if you've ever been manipulated by people who should protect you, and subscribe because sometimes the most painful truths come from the people we trust most. But as I sat in my empty house, surrounded by evidence of my children's systematic theft, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was from Robert Chen, an attorney in Des Moines, with news about DataSync Solutions, the company Jim had invested in 25 years earlier. Mrs. Richardson, I'm calling about your stock holdings in DataSync Solutions. IBM has announced their acquisition of DataSync, and your shares are now worth approximately $38 million. I dropped the phone. $38 million. The woman who had been bankrupted by her own children, who was facing foreclosure because of their theft, who had been reduced to eating donated food while they lived comfortably on stolen credit, had just become one of the wealthiest women in Iowa. My children thought they'd drained every resource I had. They believed they'd reduced their mother to a broken woman with no options and no power. They were calculating how to manage my confusion and memory problems to avoid legal consequences for their identity theft. What they didn't know was that their father's forgotten investment had just turned their victim into their judge. The mother they'd stolen from now had the resources to make them face consequences they'd never imagined. But more importantly, I finally had the financial freedom to discover what real family looked like when it was built on respect rather than exploitation. The phone rang again almost immediately. It was Rick, probably calling to continue his manipulation about my confusion. But this time, when I answered, I wasn't the same broken woman he'd been stealing from. I was someone with 38 million reasons to never be anyone's victim again. Hello, Rick, I said calmly. We need to talk. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was absolute. I spent 3 days absorbing the reality that Jim's forgotten investment had made me wealthier than anyone in Cedar Falls, while also documenting every piece of evidence that proved my children had committed identity theft and financial fraud against their own mother. My first call was to Robert Chen, the attorney handling the DataSync acquisition. Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something important. Is there any way my children can access this inheritance or claim it belongs to them? His response was reassuring. Mrs. Richardson, this stock was purchased by your husband in 1999 and held in a trust with you as the sole beneficiary. Your children have no legal claim to these funds whatsoever. However, given what you've told me about the identity theft, I'd recommend moving quickly to protect these assets and pursue criminal charges. Criminal charges. against my own children. The mother who had spent 47 years protecting Rick and Linda from consequences was about to let justice take its natural course. My second call was to the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Office, where I filed a formal report for identity theft and fraud. Detective Lisa Rodriguez was initially skeptical. Family financial disputes rarely involved actual crimes. But when I spread out the forged signatures, unauthorized credit applications, and loan documents across her desk, her expression changed completely. Mrs. Richardson, this isn't a family disagreement. This is systematic financial fraud. Your children have committed multiple felonies using your identity. She looked at the evidence for several minutes before continuing. I have to ask, are you prepared to press charges against your own family? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Was I prepared to watch my children face legal consequences for their choices? Was I ready to stop being their safety net and start being their accountability? Detective Rodriguez, they stole over $26,000 from me while I was grieving their father's death. If they weren't my children, would you hesitate to prosecute them? No, ma'am, I wouldn't. Then treat them exactly like you'd treat any other criminals. My third call was to Viridian Credit Union, where I opened new accounts that my children couldn't access and changed every password, PIN, and security question they might know. The branch manager, Tom Anderson, had known our family for 15 years and was shocked by what I revealed about Rick and Linda's fraud. Carol, I'm so sorry this happened to you. We'll freeze all the accounts they've accessed and start the process of disputing the fraudulent charges. He paused before adding, and congratulations on your inheritance. Jim would be so proud that his investment is giving you the freedom to rebuild. Rebuild. The word felt like a promise. For the first time in decades, I could build something based on my values rather than my children's emergencies. My fourth decision was the most important one. Instead of buying a smaller house and hiding my newfound wealth, I was going to create something that honored Jim's memory and helped women who'd been financially abused by their own families. Cedar Falls had no shelter specifically for women over 50, no programs for older women who'd been bankrupted by addiction, gambling, or financial abuse. I drove through town looking at properties, and that's when I found the old Wartburg Seminary building on West 4th Street. The Lutheran Seminary had relocated in 2018, and the beautiful brick building had been empty ever since. It had 32 rooms, commercial kitchens, and grounds that could accommodate gardens and recreation areas. Within 2 weeks, I'd purchased the building for $1.8 million and hired contractors to transform it into the New Beginnings Women's Center, a residential facility for women over 50 who'd lost their homes due to family financial abuse, addiction, or abandonment. But I wasn't finished with my children. They needed to understand that their crime had consequences, and that the mother they'd stolen from was no longer available to be victimized. I called Rick first, and his tone immediately shifted when he heard the confidence in my voice. Rick, I've filed criminal charges against you for identity theft and fraud. The police have all the evidence they need, and you'll be arrested within the week. The silence was so complete, I could hear his breathing. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. You're a thief who stole from his grieving mother. Being my son didn't stop you from forging my signature, so it won't stop me from pressing charges. But what about Sarah and the girls? You'll destroy our family. You destroyed our family when you chose to steal from me instead of getting help for your gambling addiction. Linda's reaction was more dramatic. She cried, screamed, threatened to hurt herself, and accused me of being a vindictive old woman who was trying to ruin her children's lives. Mom, you'll regret this for the rest of your life. We're your only family. No, Linda. You were my family until you decided to become my predators. Now you're just criminals who happen to share my DNA. Both arrests happened within 10 days. Rick was charged with 4 felonies related to identity theft and financial fraud. Linda faced similar charges, plus additional counts of falsifying documents. The Cedar Falls Courier covered the story, and suddenly everyone in town knew that Carol Richardson's children had stolen from their own mother. But instead of shame, I felt liberation. For the first time in decades, my children were facing the natural consequences of their choices without me running interference. And I had the resources to build something beautiful for women who understood what it meant to be betrayed by the people who should protect them. The real work was just beginning. The arrest of both my children sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls, but the reactions revealed more about our community than I'd expected. Some people were horrified that a mother would press criminal charges against her own children. Others saw it as long overdue justice for a woman who'd been taken advantage of for too long. Rick's arrest made the front page of the Cedar Falls Courier because of the amounts involved and the systematic nature of his identity theft. The article detailed how he'd used his mother's information to secure gambling loans, open multiple credit cards, and even attempt to refinance my house without my knowledge. His mugshot showed a man who looked older than his 47 years, worn down by addiction and poor choices. Linda's charges were equally serious, involving not just identity theft, but also falsification of documents and fraudulent loan applications. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Torres, told me their cases were among the most clear-cut examples of family financial abuse he'd ever seen. Mrs. Richardson, your children weren't just stealing money. They were systematically destroying your credit and your future while pretending to care about your well-being. The legal process moved efficiently because the evidence was overwhelming. Rick's gambling addiction had left a clear paper trail of casino transactions and online betting accounts, all funded with credit obtained using my identity. Linda's shopping habits created an equally obvious pattern of luxury purchases made with fraudulent loans in my name. Sarah, Rick's wife, filed for divorce within 3 weeks of his arrest. During their marriage, she discovered multiple instances of financial deception, but had never realized he was stealing from me to fund his gambling. "Carol, I'm so sorry," she told me when she brought my granddaughters for what might be our last visit. "I knew Rick had problems, but I never imagined he was stealing from you." My granddaughters, Emma and Ella, now 9 years old, were confused and angry. They'd been told their grandmother was sick and confused, so Rick's arrest didn't match the narrative they'd been given. When Sarah explained that their father had stolen money from me, Emma asked, "Why would Daddy steal from Grandma Carol? She always helped us." That question broke my heart because it revealed how my unconditional giving had been visible even to children, while their father's theft had been hidden behind lies and manipulation. Linda's reaction to her arrest was more dramatic and manipulative. She launched a social media campaign claiming I was suffering from dementia and had been confused into pressing false charges against my loving children. She posted photos of our family's happy times, claiming I was being manipulated by greedy lawyers who wanted to steal my inheritance. But Linda's campaign backfired when several of her former friends came forward with stories about her borrowing money and never repaying it, asking for emergency help that turned out to fund shopping sprees, and bragging about how easy it was to get money from her guilt-ridden mother. The court proceedings were swift and decisive. Rick pled guilty to 4 felony counts and was sentenced to 30 months in prison plus restitution of $28,000. Linda fought the charges initially, but eventually accepted a plea deal that included 18 months in prison and repayment of $19,000. During their sentencing hearings, both of my children gave speeches about how much they loved me and how sorry they were for their mistakes. Rick claimed his gambling addiction was a disease that had clouded his judgment. Linda insisted that financial stress had driven her to make poor decisions that she regretted. But neither of them took real responsibility for the systematic way they'd exploited my love and trust. Their apologies focused on how their actions had hurt themselves and their children, not on the devastating impact their theft had on their victim, me. The judge in Rick's case, Judge Sarah Patterson, didn't accept their excuses. "Mr. Richardson, your mother worked her entire life to support your family, and you repaid her sacrifice by stealing her identity and destroying her financial security. The fact that she's your mother makes your crime worse, not better." Linda received an equally stern lecture from Judge David Morrison. Ms. Richardson, you used your education to manipulate your mother and then suggested she was mentally incompetent when she discovered your theft. Your behavior shows a level of calculation and manipulation that deserves significant consequences. The restitution orders meant my children would be paying me back for years, but I donated every penny they repaid to the New Beginnings Women's Center. I didn't want their money. I wanted them to understand that actions have consequences and that love without boundaries isn't love at all. But the most important consequence wasn't legal. It was personal. For the first time in decades, I was free from the constant anxiety of waiting for the next financial emergency, the next desperate phone call, the next manipulation disguised as a family crisis. I could finally use my resources to help women who understood gratitude instead of enabling children who saw generosity as weakness. The transformation of the old Wartburg Seminary building into a women's shelter became my obsession and my salvation. Using $4 million of my inheritance, I hired architects and contractors to create something unprecedented in Iowa, a residential facility specifically designed for women over 50 who'd lost their homes due to family financial abuse, addiction, or abandonment. The renovation took 11 months, during which I lived in a small apartment I rented downtown. Every morning, I'd arrive at the construction site to watch the progress and the promise of creating something beautiful from abandonment. The contractors, led by a wonderful woman named Beth Patterson, initially thought I was spending too much money on fancy accommodations for homeless women. But as the project progressed and I shared stories about why this mattered, Beth's attitude changed completely. Mrs. Richardson, my own aunt, was nearly homeless after her son stole her retirement savings for drugs. She was too ashamed to tell anyone until it was almost too late. By the end of construction, Beth's entire crew had donated extra time to make the center even more beautiful than originally planned. The New Beginnings Women's Center officially opened in February 2022, providing safe, dignified housing for women who'd been written off by society. Our first resident was Dorothy Martinez, a 68-year-old woman whose daughter had convinced her to co-sign loans, then left her responsible for $30,000 in debt. Dorothy arrived with one suitcase and a lifetime of shame about trusting the wrong person. "Carol, I raised that girl after her father abandoned us," she told me while we toured her private room with its own bathroom and small sitting area. "I worked double shifts at the meatpacking plant to give her opportunities, and she repaid me by destroying my credit. How do you get over something like that?" "You don't get over it," I told her honestly. "You get through it. And you learn that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when life gets hard." Within 8 months, we were housing 28 women, each with her own story of betrayal and recovery. Margaret Foster had been financially abused by her son's gambling addiction. Rita Jackson's daughter had stolen her Social Security checks to fund a drug habit. Helen Murphy's entire family had conspired to have her declared incompetent so they could access her life insurance payout. But the New Beginnings Women's Center wasn't just emergency housing. It was a community of women who understood each other's pain and supported each other's healing. We created job training programs for women over 50, financial literacy classes to prevent future abuse, and support groups for mothers who'd been victimized by their own children. My favorite addition was the workshop where women could learn new skills: pottery, gardening, woodworking, and jewelry making. Watching 70-year-old women discover talents they'd never known they had became my daily source of joy. Dorothy Martinez, who'd arrived broken and ashamed, became our lead gardening instructor and started selling vegetables at the Cedar Falls Farmers Market. The grounds behind the center bloomed with flowers and vegetables tended by women who'd thought their productive lives were over. Margaret Foster, who'd never gardened before, created a memorial garden for women who died homeless, with a bench inscribed, "You mattered, you were loved, you are remembered." "Carol, for the first time in my life, I'm growing something instead of just giving it away," she told me while we planted roses in memory of women who hadn't survived their family betrayals. Our success attracted attention from social workers and nonprofit organizations across Iowa and Illinois. The model we'd created, Long-term residential support combined with job training and emotional healing was being studied as a template for other communities. I started receiving invitations to speak at conferences about family financial abuse and the unique challenges facing older women who'd been bankrupted by their own relatives. But the most meaningful moments weren't the public recognition. They were the small victories I witnessed every day. Rita Jackson got her first job in 15 years as a school crossing guard. Helen Murphy started taking online college courses at age 71 and discovered a passion for social work. Dorothy Martinez reconnected with a cousin she'd lost touch with and learned that she wasn't the only family member who'd been victimized by financial abuse. The center also became a place where healthy family relationships could be rebuilt. Several residents had adult children who came forward to apologize for their relatives' behavior and offer genuine support. These family reunions reminded me that not all families are toxic and that love can sometimes survive even the deepest betrayals. My own healing accelerated as I watched other women reclaim their dignity and rebuild their lives. Working with women who'd survived similar betrayals helped me understand that I wasn't uniquely naive or foolish. Family financial abuse was a widespread problem that thrived on shame and silence. 2.5 years after opening, the New Beginnings Women's Center had helped over 90 women transition from crisis to stability. Some found permanent housing and jobs, others reconnected with healthy family members, and many simply discovered that their lives weren't over just because their children had betrayed them. I'd used my inheritance to create something that honored both Jim's memory and my own hard-learned wisdom about the difference between love and enabling. Every woman who walked through our doors represented a choice to invest in people who understood gratitude rather than those who mistook generosity for weakness. But my own family story wasn't finished yet. Rick was released from prison last fall after serving 22 months of his 30-month sentence. He'd completed a gambling addiction program and earned certifications in electrical work while incarcerated, and according to his parole officer, he'd been a model prisoner who seemed genuinely committed to changing his life. His first call came on a Thursday evening while I was helping Dorothy Martinez prepare for her photography exhibition at the Cedar Falls Community Arts Center. "Mom, I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but I was hoping we could meet for coffee sometime. I have things I need to say to you." The man who met me at Cup of Joe downtown looked different from the desperate, lying son who'd stolen my identity 4 years earlier. Prison had aged him, but more importantly, it had humbled him. "Mom, I want to start by saying I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for money or help. I just need you to know that I understand what I did to you." For the first time in his adult life, Rick took full responsibility for his choices without making excuses or blaming external circumstances. "I used your love against you, and I exploited your grief when Dad died. I convinced myself that I was just borrowing money, but I knew I was stealing from the woman who'd sacrificed everything for me." Linda's journey has been more complicated. She served 15 months and was released last summer, but her approach to redemption still shows traces of manipulation. She's asked to volunteer at the New Beginnings Women's Center, claiming she wants to give back and make amends, but I've declined her offers. "Linda, you can make amends by building an honest life and taking responsibility for your choices," I told her during our one post-prison conversation. "But you can't volunteer at a center for women who've been financially abused by family members. You are the problem we're trying to solve." She didn't like that answer, but it's the truth. Some relationships can be repaired, and some cannot. The damage my children inflicted wasn't just financial. It was the destruction of trust that can never be fully rebuilt. If this story of consequences, justice, and the power of saying no touched your heart, like this video right now, tell me in the comments about a time when you had to choose between being kind and being smart, and subscribe to Grandma's Legacy. Because every woman deserves to learn that love without boundaries isn't love at all. I'm sitting here in the sunroom of the New Beginnings Women's Center, surrounded by women who chose healing over bitterness, growth over victimhood, and new families over old disappointments. At 74 years old, I've learned that the greatest inheritance you can leave isn't money. It's the knowledge that everyone deserves respect, even from their own children. Jim's forgotten investment gave me more than $38 million. It gave me the power to discover what unconditional love actually looks like when it's earned rather than exploited, appreciated rather than taken for granted, and freely given rather than demanded as payment for past sacrifices. Remember, you can't buy respect, but you can stop funding disrespect. Sometimes the family that drains you isn't the family that sustains you. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them face the natural consequences of their choices, even when that someone is your own child. The women I chose me back. That's the difference between real family and biological obligation. Real family is mutual, voluntary, and built on gratitude rather than guilt. My children taught me that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling disguised as sacrifice.